Good evening and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Pull the blanket close, breathe in the warmth of the room, and let your thoughts slow. Tonight we'll travel far back in time to the edge of a new world when gratitude was not yet a holiday, but a hard-won act of survival. And as you listen, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Share it down in the comments. Our little circle of light spans continents and time zones, joined by the same curiosity that brought people together centuries ago. And of course, if you'd like more journeys into the hidden corners of Lullaby Historian, be sure to subscribe. Each story opens a window into how we came to celebrate and why we remember. Now close your eyes if you'd like and visualize this. How were castles used in medieval times? The granite respiration, the architecture of cold air. To enter the heart of a medieval castle, such as the massive, silent keeps of Northumbria or the rugged fortresses of the Welsh marches, is to step out of the rhythm of the natural world and into the static pneuma of the stone. In the 13th century, a castle was not merely a military machine, it was a mineral lung. This first movement, the granite respiration, explores the boring history of how air, temperature, and moisture interacted with the infinite loom of the masonry. For the American mind, accustomed to the lightweight, insulated stick frame architecture of the suburbs, the medieval castle represents a monolithic stasis. It is a world where the atmosphere does not change with the hour, but with the century. The thermal mass, the rhythm of the deep cold. A castle's primary reality is its thermal inertia. A wall of limestone or granite 10 feet thick does not heat or cool in the way we understand. Instead, it absorbs the seasonal cycle into a low-frequency vibration. The atmosphere inside the Great Hall is one of mineral permanence. Even in the height of July, the core of the stone retains the memory of January. The sound of this stasis is the rhythm of the silent pressure. It is a weight of air. Because the stone is so dense, it crushes the external noise of the forest and the village, leaving only a vacuum of sound. This is the boring history of the acoustic void. The only vibration is the rhythmic hum of the earth conducted through the foundations. The stones do not move, yet they respire by drawing the moisture from the air and rhythmically exhaling it back as a fine, cold mist. To touch the wall is to feel the skin of the giant, a surface that is perpetually damp and rhythmically chilled. The arrow slit, the rhythm of the aqueous draught. The only breach in this mineral lung is the arrow slit or embrasure. These narrow vertical gashes in the stone are the nostrils of the castle. The atmosphere around an embrasure is one of linear acceleration. Because of the Venturi effect, the vast, slow-moving air of the valley is compressed as it enters the slit, turning into a sharp, cold needle of wind. The sound is the rhythm of the constant sigh, whoosh. This is the whistle of the stone. It is a static note that never changes pitch unless the direction of the gale shifts. This draft creates a microclimate of friction. As the cold air hits the heavy, stale air of the interior, it produces a rhythmic swirl and fade. For the sentinel standing in the niche, the boring history of the watch is the history of this rhythmic cooling. The wind rhythmically nips at the woolen tunic, creating a fibrous vibration that is the only companion in the silence. The air does not just move, it carves a path through the darkness, a rhythmic ghost that reminds the inhabitant that the infinite loom of the world is still spinning outside the walls. The spiral stair, the rhythm of the vortex. Linking the various chambers of stasis is the spiral staircase, a stone screw driven into the heart of the tower. This is the castle's trachea. The atmosphere within the stairwell is one of cyclical confinement. The air here is colder and denser than in the halls, trapped in a rhythmic spiral. The sound is the rhythm of the echoing step. Because of the perfect geometry of the stone steps, every footfall produces a cylindrical echo. Clack, clack, clack. The sound travels up and down the vortex in a rhythmic spiral, becoming muffled and distorted as it hits the curved walls. This is the boring history of vertical transit. To climb the stairs is to engage in a repetitive circular labor. The body enters a rhythmic sway, the left shoulder always brushing the central newel, the right foot always finding the wide edge of the tread. The infinite loom of the staircase is a process of constant rotation, a rhythmic movement that feels like winding the clock of the building. The condensation drip, the rhythm of the mineral tear. In the deep winter, the granite respiration reaches its most liquid phase. As the warmth of the measured hearth in the great hall meets the deep cold of the outer walls, the stones begin to weep. The atmosphere is one of saturated stillness. The sound is the master rhythm of the night, the mineral drip. Tink, tink, tink. This is the liquid metronome of the castle. Water gathers on the vaulted ceilings, hanging in rhythmic droplets before falling onto the flagstone floor. This is the boring history of erosion. Each drop is a small percussive act that has been repeated for 700 years. The sound is crisp and final. It resonates through the acoustic vacuum, a rhythmic reminder that even the great stasis of the stone is subject to the slow dissolve of the water. The inhabitant, lying in a woolen cocoon of blankets, listens to the rhythm of the weeping wall, a sound that sings the stone to sleep. The vaulted ceiling, the rhythm of the trapped echo. The respiration concludes in the geometry of the arch. The vaulted ceilings of the undercrofts and chapels act as acoustic catch basins. The atmosphere is heavy and arched shadow. The sound is the rhythm of the reveration. A single cough, a rhythmic chink of a chain, or the sigh of a priest is captured by the stone ribs of the vault and rhythmically rotated above the head. The sound does not die, it decays slowly. The infinite loom of the castle's architecture is designed to hold the sound as much as it holds the heat. As the pale grey light of the morning enters through the arrow slits, the granite respiration remains unchanged. The castle has breathed through another night, its rhythmic stasis a monument to the unchanging, waiting in a mineral dream for the rhythm of the hearth to wake the day. The measured hearth, the slow pulse of the ash. While the granite respiration defined the castle's external shell, its internal life was governed by a different, warmer cadence, the metabolism of the fire. In the medieval world, heat was not a utility that could be toggled. It was a living guest that required constant rhythmic attention. This was the era of the measured hearth, a movement defined by the rhythmic accumulation and consumption of carbon. To manage a castle's fires was to engage in a boring history of thermal persistence. For the American reader, used to the invisible forced air heat of the 21st century, the hearth represents a visceral economy where every degree of warmth was paid for in manual rhythm. the woodyard's percussion, the rhythm of the thud and crack. The hearth's life began in the courtyard at the massive piles of seasoned oak, beech and ash. The atmosphere was one of splintered toil. The air smelled of dry bark, fresh sap, and the metallic tang of the iron axe. The sound was the rhythm of the symmetric strike. To provide for the great hall, the woodcutters engaged in a repetitive mechanical labor. The sound was a rhythmic whir, thump, crack. Whir, the axe in the air; thump, the contact; and crack, the splitting of the grain. This was the percussion of the fuel. Every strike was a rhythmic unit of potential heat. The boring history of the log pile was the history of spatial inventory. The wood was stacked in rhythmic grids, ensuring that the air could circulate to dry the timber. To the woodcutter, the day was not measured in hours, but in the rhythmic shrinking of the pile and the rhythmic growing of the split cords. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of energy that would soon be unraveled in the flames of the keep. The great hall's maw, the rhythm of the slow burn log. Inside the keep, the hearth was a stone cavern built into the wall. The atmosphere was one of opaque radiance. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of wood smoke and the dry heat of the masonry. The sound was the rhythm of the combustion sigh. Unlike a modern campfire, the castle hearth used massive 5-foot logs that burned with a low-frequency roar. This was the constant rhythmic crackle and hiss. Crackle, pop, hiss. This was the heartbeat of the room. The boring history of the Andiron was the history of thermal elevation. By lifting the logs on iron supports, the fire could breathe from below. The fire stoker's movement was a rhythmic vigil. Every hour he would use a long iron poker to rhythmically turn and shift the glowing mass. The sound was a rhythmic scrape and thud as the carbonized wood collapsed under its own weight. This was the rhythm of the collapse, a sound that signaled the thermal apex of the log before it surrendered to the ash. The ash bed, the rhythm of the insulated ember. The secret to the castle's warmth was not the flame, but the accumulated ash. In the 14th century, the hearth was never fully cleaned. The atmosphere was one of dusty insulation. The sound was the rhythm of the sifting whisper. As the logs burned down, they added to a deep grey mattress of ash. This bed acted as a thermal battery, holding the heat long after the flames died. The boring history of the ember was the history of the covered fire. At night, the stoker would bank the fire, rhythmically covering the glowing coals with a thick layer of ash to keep them sleeping until morning. The sound was a rhythmic shovel and sift, a sound like dry silk. This rhythmic burial ensured that the infinite loom of the fire was never broken, but only paused in a state of red-hot stillness. The kitchen's cauldron, the rhythm of the boil. In the lower kitchens, the hearth served a nutritional rhythm. Here, the fire was not for comfort, but for the metabolism of the stew. The atmosphere was one of steam and carbon. The sound was the rhythm of the convected bubble. A massive iron pot hung over the flames, its contents in a constant rhythmic seethe. Glub, glub, pop. This was the sonic pulse of the kitchen. The sound was heavy and viscous. The pot hook was the history of adjustable gravity. By rhythmically moving the pot up or down the iron chain, the cook could tune the heat. The sound was a rhythmic clink, clink, splash. The infinite loom of the kitchen was the rhythmic transformation of the raw into the cooked, a process governed by the measured breath of the fire beneath the soot-stained rafters. The morning rebirth, the rhythm of the rising smoke. The cycle of the hearth concluded at dawn with the rhythmic awakening. The atmosphere was one of cold grey transition. The sound was the rhythm of the gentle puff.
the stoker would return to the ash bed and rhythmically blow and stir the buried embers. As the air hit the coals, they would glow with a rhythmic intensity, turning from grey to orange. The sound was a rhythmic whoosh and crackle as the first dry twigs of the new day caught the heat. The flue was the history of the vertical ascent. As the smoke began to rise, it created a rhythmic flutter in the chimney, a sound like distant wings. The measured hearth had survived the night. The castle, which had been static and cold in the dark, was once again pulsing with thermal life. The infinite loom of the wood and the ash was rewound for another 24 hours, its rhythmic warmth a living shield against the granite respiration of the winter stone.
The portcullis cadence, the percussion of iron and chain. If the granite respiration was the castle's breath and the measured hearth its metabolism, then the portcullis cadence was its mechanical voice. In the medieval world, the gateway was the great articulation of the structure. It was the only part of the static stone that was designed to move with a rhythmic, heavy purpose. This movement was not the swift, silent automation of the modern era, but a symphony of gravity and metal. This was the boring history of access and exclusion. For the American reader, the portcullis represents the ultimate physicality of the boundary, a study in the rhythmic tension of the winch and the metallic groan of the archive. The windlass chamber, the rhythm of the strained rotation. The portcullis did not rise by magic, it rose through the manual agony of the windlass. Located in a small vaulted chamber above the gatehouse, the windlass was a massive horizontal cylinder of oak bound in iron. The atmosphere in this room was one of oily mechanical toil. The air smelled of rancid tallow used to grease the axle, dusty timber, and the metallic tang of rusted iron. The sound was the master rhythm of the morning, the click and strain. Two men would stand at opposite ends of the windlass, grasping the heavy wooden handles. The sound was a rhythmic groan, clack, groan, plack. Groan, the wood twisting under the weight of the gate. Clack, the iron pawl falling into the teeth of the ratchet to prevent the gate from falling. This was the rhythm of the lift. The ratchet was the history of incremental progress. Each clack represented only 3 inches of upward movement. To the men in the chamber, the day began with this repetitive, muscle-burning cadence. The infinite loom of the castle's opening was a mechanical ritual that could take half an hour of sustained rhythmic effort. The wood of the windlass would squeak and protest in a high-frequency counterpoint to the low-frequency clang of the chains, a rhythmic dialogue between the organic timber and the inorganic stone. The vertical groove, the rhythm of the stone on iron friction. As the gate rose, it moved within 2 vertical channels carved into the stone walls of the gatehouse. This was the geometry of the slide. The atmosphere within the tunnel was one of echoing vibration. The sound was the rhythm of the metallic scrape. The edges of the portcullis, a grid of heavy oak beams shod in iron, would brush and bounce against the limestone walls. The sound was a rhythmic shh, grind, shh. The slide, grind, the impact. This was the sound of the friction. The friction mark was the history of the millennial polish. Over centuries, the rhythmic movement of the iron against the stone would wear the channel into a smooth, glossy surface. To the inhabitant, this sound was reassuring. It was a mechanical pulse that vibrated through the floor of the keep. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of motion within a fabric of stasis. The gate was a sliding knife that cut the geometry of the grey into 2 worlds, the internal sanctuary and the external void. The dusk closure, the rhythm of the free fall arrest. The most dramatic rhythm of the portcullis occurred at sunset during the closing of the mouth. The atmosphere was one of final heavy closure.
The rhythm was the controlled descent. The men at the windlass would release the pawl, and the gate would begin its rhythmic return to the earth. The sound was a rapid, rhythmic clatter, clatter, clatter as the chain unspooled from the drum. Clack, 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 clack. This was the percussion of the ending.
The night watch, the rhythm of the chain swing. Throughout the night, the portcullis remained static, but it was never silent. The atmosphere in the gatehouse tunnel was one of hollow, metallic suspense. The sound was the rhythm of the ghostly clink. Because the portcullis was suspended by its chains, even the slightest midnight breeze through the tunnel would cause the iron grid to oscillate slightly. The sound was a faint, rhythmic chink, 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 the sound of iron links rubbing together. Tink, chink, tink. This was the clock of the gate. The boring history of the iron link was the history of the constant wear. This rhythmic swaying, repeated for a century, would polish the chain until it shone like silver in the moonlight. To the guard standing nearby, the chink-chink was a rhythmic breath, a reminder that the gate was alive, even in its sleep. The portcullis was a sleeping sentinel, its rhythmic metallic sigh a mechanical lullaby for the castle. The infinite loom of the chain was resting, waiting for the rhythm of the windlass to begin the cycle of the opening once more in the grey light of the dawn. The tallow vigil, the rhythmic hiss of the flame. If the castle's architecture was a geometry of the grey, its interior life was a chronology of the flickering wick. In the 14th century, light was not a constant, it was a consumable commodity that moved with a rhythmic decay. This was the era of the tallow vigil, a movement defined by the rhythmic consumption of animal fat. To illuminate a castle was to engage in a boring history of combustion maintenance. For the American reader, used to the instant sterile stability of the LED, the tallow candle represents the biological reality of light, a study in the scent of the rendered and the rhythmic falling of the wax. The rendering vat, the rhythm of the saturated stir. The light of the castle began not in the candle holder, but in the boiling vat of the tallow chandler. The atmosphere was one of heavy, oily humidity. The air was thick with the primal scent of the slaughter, a sweet, cloying aroma of rendered mutton fat and burnt bone. The sound was the rhythm of the liquid thickening. The chandler would use a large wooden paddle to rhythmically churn and sift the molten fat, removing the cracklings, the solid impurities. The sound was a rhythmic slosh and gurgle. Slosh, glug, slosh. This was the rhythm of the fuel. The boring history of the wick dip was the history of incremental layering. The chandler would take a frame of cotton or rush wicks and rhythmically dip and cool them into the vat. Dip, lift, wait. Each cycle added a fraction of an inch to the candle's diameter. This was the loom of the light. To the chandler, the day was measured in the rhythmic thickening of the white cylinders. By evening, 1,000 rhythmic units of time were hanging from the rafters, waiting to be unraveled by the flame in the dark halls of the keep. The rushlight's hiss, the rhythm of the fibrous burn. For the lesser servants and the peripheral corridors, the castle relied on the rushlight. This was the low-frequency light of the medieval world. The atmosphere was one of smoky obscurity. The sound was the rhythm of the spitting fibre. A rushlight, a meadow rush dipped once in fat, was held in a horizontal iron clip. Because the fat was often unrefined, it contained micro pockets of moisture that would explode when they hit the flame. The sound was a rhythmic pop and sizzle, pop, sizzle, hiss. This was the sound of the corridor. The boring history of the tilt was the history of adjustable combustion. Because the rush was thin, it had to be rhythmically adjusted by the user to prevent it from burning out too quickly or dripping onto the floor.
This created a rhythmic maintenance for the passerby, a constant small motion of the hand to feed the flame. The rushlight was a fragile pulse, a rhythmic reminder that in the geometry of the grey, light was a fugitive substance that required a constant vigil. The great tallow, the rhythm of the falling tear. In the Lord's solar and the private chambers, the tallow candle provided a more stately respiration. The atmosphere was one of yellow radiance and greasy shadows. The sound was the master rhythm of the night, the drip and set. As the flame consumed the fat, it created a pool of liquid fuel at the top of the candle. Every few minutes, a rhythmic tear of molten tallow would break the surface and run down the side of the candle. The sound was a rhythmic patter and plink as it hit the brass or iron drip pan. Drip, set, drip, set. This was the liquid clock.
The snuffers was the history of the clean flame. Unlike modern candles, medieval wicks did not self-consume. They grew long and coked, causing the flame to smoke and flicker. The servant would perform the rhythmic snip and clear, using iron shears to rhythmically behead the wick. The sound was a rhythmic click and darken, click, hiss. This mechanical punctuation kept the light breathing with a steady amber pulse. The candle was a sacrifice of the flesh, a rhythmic conversion of the biological into the luminous. The shadow dance, the rhythm of the elastic wall. The most haunting effect of the tallow vigil was the animation of the architecture. Because the flame was unstable and subject to the granite respiration, the drafts, the light was in a state of constant vibration. The sound was the rhythmic flutter and snap of the flame against a draft. This was the visual pulse. The shadows on the stone walls, the geometry of the arches would rhythmically stretch and contract. A pillar would become a rhythmic giant, its shadow swaying back and forth in a mechanical lullaby. The visual fatigue was the history of the vibrating room. To read a manuscript or sew a tapestry by tallow light was to participate in a rhythmic tax on the eyes. The brain had to recalibrate the room as the light throbbed. The infinite loom of the castle was woven with these vibrating threads of yellow light. The inhabitant lived in a pulsing reality, where the only solid thing was the rhythmic hiss of the fat and the static cold of the stone beyond the amber circle. The final gutter, the rhythm of the blue flame death. The cycle of the vigil concluded with the rhythmic extinction. As the candle reached the bottom of its holder, it entered its final respiration. The atmosphere was one of acrid fading. The sound was the rhythm of the final sputter. The flame would turn small and blue, rhythmically lapping at the metal of the socket. The sound was a faint rhythmic hiss and pop as the last drop of fat was consumed. Hiss, pop, gone. This was the death of the day's light. The lingering scent was the history of the ghostly aftermath. Long after the light was gone, the heavy blue smoke of the tallow would rhythmically drift and curl through the rafters. The smell of rendered fat would remain, a rhythmic ghost of the fire. The inhabitant, now safe in the absolute black of the keep, would breathe in this oily memory as they drifted into sleep. The infinite loom of the flame had finished its weave, leaving only the static geometry of the cold stone to guard the rhythmic silence of the castle until the dawn's first light. The tapestry's loom, the rhythmic insulation of wool. If the granite respiration was the castle's bone and the tallow vigil its fleeting sight, then the tapestry's loom was its soft, fibrous shield. In the medieval world, walls were not merely boundaries, they were radiators of cold. To inhabit a castle was to live in a perpetual state of acoustic and thermal war against the stone. This was the era of woolen insulation, a movement defined by the rhythmic interlacing of the warp and weft.
For the American reader, the tapestry represents the organic counterpoint to the mineral, a study in the rhythmic muffling of the echo and the slow, fibrous breath of the wall. The weaving shed, the rhythm of the mechanical pulse. The life of the tapestry began in the atmospheric humidity of the weaving room. The air smelled of raw lanolin, vegetable dyes, and wet flax. It was a space of ordered motion where the infinite loom was a physical reality. The sound was the master rhythm of the creation, the shifting of the shed. The weavers worked in a synchronized cadence. The sound was a rhythmic thump, clack, swoosh. Thump, the treadle being depressed, clack, the wooden heedles shifting, and swoosh, the shuttle carrying the yarn through the opening. This was the percussion of the industry. Every thump was a rhythmic step towards the completion of a masterpiece. The batten was the history of the compressed thread. After each pass of the shuttle, the weaver would use a heavy wooden comb to rhythmically beat down the yarn. The sound was a rhythmic clack, clack, clack. This ensured that the fabric was dense and windproof. To the weaver, the day was a fractal journey, the rhythmic hand-over-hand motion of the wool becoming a solid wall of color. The loom was an engine of density, turning the fragile hair of the sheep into a mineral-hard textile. The iron ring was the rhythm of the heavy hanging. Once completed, the tapestry was transported to the great hall to be married to the stone. This was the rhythm of the suspension. The atmosphere was one of dusty elevation.
The sound was the rhythmic chink and thud. Massive iron rings were driven into the masonry, and the heavy wool was hoisted into place. The sound was a rhythmic creak and rustle as the fibers took the weight of their own gravity. Creak, sigh. This was the sonic transformation of the room. The boring history of the air gap was the history of the thermal buffer. The tapestry did not touch the stone. It hung an inch away, creating a rhythmic pocket of still air. This static layer prevented the granite respiration from reaching the inhabitants. The sound of the tapestry hanging was an acoustically dead. It swallowed the sharp pings of the drip and the whistles of the arrow slit, replacing them with a low-frequency muffle. The room became a sanctuary of softness. The fibrous breath, the rhythm of the gentle sway. A tapestry was never static. Because it was suspended, it responded to the rhythmic pressures of the castle's drafts. The atmosphere was one of animated surface. The sound was the rhythm of the soft brush. When a draft entered the room, the tapestry would rhythmically billow and sigh. The sound was a faint, rhythmic shh as the wool brushed against the limestone. Shh, pulse. This was the breathing of the wall. To the observer, the geometry of the hunt or the geometry of the saint depicted on the cloth would appear to move. This was the boring history of visual depth. The elasticity of the surface created a rhythmic vibration of the image. The tapestry was a loom of illusion, turning the rigid stone into a fluid horizon. The inhabitant, sitting by the measured hearth, would watch the rhythmic ripple of the wool, a sound and sight that provided a mechanical comfort against the inhuman stillness of the fortress. The dusting rod, the rhythm of the cloud release. Over time, the tapestry became a magnet for the minute. It captured the soot of the tallow and the dust of the flour. This led to the rhythm of the cleaning. The atmosphere was one of granular explosion. The sound was the rhythmic whack, whack, whack. Once a year, the hangings were taken down and beaten with wooden rods. The sound was a heavy, muffled percussion. Thump, thump, thump. With every strike, a rhythmic cloud of history was released into the air, a mixture of wool fibers and smoke. The boring history of the moth vigil was the history of biological defense.
Herbs like lavender and wormwood were rhythmically sewn into the folds of the wool. The sound was a rhythmic crackle and scent release. The infinite loom of the tapestry was a living archive that required constant rhythmic refreshment. The cleaning was a purification ritual, ensuring the fibrous shield remained supple and strong for another decade. The midnight muffle, the rhythm of the silent barrier. The cycle of the tapestry concluded in the absolute stillness of the dark. The atmosphere was one of saturated acoustic silence. The sound was the rhythm of the absorbed echo. In a room lined with wool, the sound of a dropping candle or a shifting guard was stripped of its resonance. It was a hollow thud that died instantly. This was the rhythm of the piece. The tapestry acted as a sonic filter, separating the rhythmic chaos of the exterior from the rhythmic sleep of the interior. The boring history of the bed curtain was the history of the personal cocoon. Inside the tapestry-lined bed, the inhabitant breathed their own recycled warmth, a rhythmic respiration that was insulated from the world. The infinite loom had finished its weave. The wool was warm, dark, and still, a fibrous promise that the cold of the void would never breach the rhythmic sanctuary of the castle. The inhabitant drifted off to the faint, ghostly rustle of the wool, safe within the enclosure of the loom. The granary's breath, the scent of silt and stasis. If the tapestry's loom was the castle's skin, then the granary's breath was its deep caloric reserve. In the medieval world, wealth was not a digital abstraction, but a granular reality stored in the dark. To enter the castle's storage vaults was to step into a world of absolute biological suspension. This was the era of granary stasis, a movement defined by the rhythmic measurement of survival. For the American reader, the granary represents the industrial stillness of the harvest, a study in the dry scent of the chaff and the rhythmic weight of the bushel. The undercroft's air, the rhythm of the dry dust. The granary was located in the coolest, driest part of the castle, the lower stone vaults. The atmosphere was one of desiccated gravity. The air smelled of toasted earth, ancient silt, and the metallic sharpness of salt. Unlike the humid respiration of the upper halls, the air here was bone dry, designed to stop the rhythm of decay.
The sound was the rhythm of the settling husk. Even in total darkness, the grain was never truly silent. The boring history of grain settlement was the sound of a million tiny seeds shifting under their own pressure. It was a faint, rhythmic s, tick, s, the slide, tick, the contact. This was the sound of the archive. For the steward, the day began with the rhythmic inspection, the sound of a wooden shovel cutting into the pile, a rhythmic scrape and lift that revealed the golden wealth beneath the surface. The bustle's strike, the rhythm of the measured pour. Distribution was a ritual of mechanical precision. The atmosphere was one of accountable dust. The air was filled with a fine golden haze of chaff that danced in the rhythmic beams of light from the high, narrow vents. The sound was the rhythmic drumming of the grain. When the steward poured wheat into a wooden bushel measure, it produced a rhythmic patter and roar. Patter, the first few grains; roar, the full stream. This was the percussion of the ration. Once the measure was full, the steward would perform the strike, using a flat wooden bar to rhythmically scrape off the excess grain. The sound was a rhythmic zing-clack. Zing, the bar across the wood; clack, the falling grain. The boring history of the fair measure was the history of the level horizon. To the castle inhabitant, this sound was sonic security.
It was the rhythmic proof that the infinite loom of the harvest would sustain the great stasis of the winter. Every clack of the strike was a rhythmic unit of time purchased against the threat of hunger. The salt cask, the rhythm of the mineral preservation. Beside the brain stood the salting tubs, the chemical guardians of the castle's meat. The atmosphere was one of astringent cold. The air here was heavy and saline, tasting of sea spray and dried blood. The sound was the rhythm of the granular scour. To preserve the autumn slaughter, the cook would engage in a repetitive, abrasive labor. The sound was a rhythmic rip and rub, the sound of coarse salt being massaged into sides of pork. Rip, rub, slap. This was the rhythm of the preservation. The boring history of the salt crust was the history of biological erasure. The salt would rhythmically draw the moisture from the flesh, turning it into a mineral-hard slab. The sound of the salt being scooped from the wooden cask was a rhythmic shovel and sift, a sound like crushing glass. The infinite loom of the salt room was the rhythmic halt of time, turning the organic into the eternal. The rodent vigil, the rhythm of the scuttle and pause. Because the granary was a palace of energy, it attracted unwanted rhythms. The atmosphere was one of subterranean tension. The sound was the rhythm of the stealthy scratch. Deep within the mounds of barley, there was the rhythmic pit-pat of tiny paws and the nip-nip of teeth against the husk. To counter this, the castle maintained the rhythmic presence of the cat. The sound was the silent prowl, a rhythmic absence of sound, followed by the sudden sharp clatter of a falling bin lid. This was the boring history of warehouse defense. The granary was a rhythmic battlefield between accumulation and loss. The infinite loom of the castle's survival depended on this static vigil. The steward would rhythmically tap the bins with a staff to announce his presence, a sound of thud, thud, thud that sent the rhythmic pests back into the shadows. The sated stillness, the rhythm of the full vault. The cycle of the granary concluded in the absolute gravity of the storehouse. The atmosphere was one of heavy, dusty satisfaction. The sound was the rhythm of the collective weight. 10,000 bushels of grain created a sonic muffle that was even deeper than the tapestry's loom. It was a dead air. This was the rhythm of the reserve. The castle was a silo of stone, its rhythmic respiration slowed to a glacial pace. The boring history of the winter store was the history of the silent guard. As the moon rose over the battlements, the granary remained immovable and still, a rhythmic promise that the static geometry of the castle would endure. The inhabitant, knowing the vaults were heavy and full, breathed in the rhythmic scent of the chaff, a smell of earth and safety that provided the final peace before sleep. The infinite loom of the grain was static, waiting in the mineral dark for the rhythm of the morning mill to begin the cycle of the flour. The scriptorium's scratch, the rhythmic pulse of the ink. If the granary's breath was the castle's physical reserve, the scriptorium's scratch was its intellectual lung. In the medieval world, information was not a digital flash, but a mineral and biological deposit left on skin. To enter the castle's scriptorium, usually a small solar-lit room high in the keep, was to witness the rhythmic transformation of thought into mass. This was the era of the static archive, a movement defined by the rhythmic erosion of the quill. For the American reader, the scriptorium represents the industrial slowness of memory, a study in the astringent scent of oak gall and the rhythmic vibration of the parchment. The preparation of the skin, the rhythm of the pumice scour. A book began not with a word, but with the mechanical preparation of the surface. The atmosphere was one of dusty calcification. The air smelled of chalk, dried animal skin, and sharp vinegar. The sound was the rhythm of the continuous grate. The scribe would take a sheet of vellum, dried calfskin, and rhythmically scrape and sand it with a piece of pumice stone to remove any remaining hair or oils. The sound was a rhythmic shh, 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 shh. This was the rhythm of the smoothing. The boring history of the surface tension was the history of the receptive pore. If the skin was too oily, the ink would bead. If too dry, it would flake. The scribe's hand moved in rhythmic spirals, feeling for the perfect velvet of the skin. This was the loom of the page. To the scribe, the day began with this repetitive tactile ritual, turning the biological membrane into a geological foundation for the law or the liturgy. The quill's edge, the rhythm of the knife and nib. Before the first letter was written, the instrument of the archive had to be tuned. The atmosphere was one of surgical precision. The sound was the rhythm of the steel on feather. The scribe would take a goose quill and rhythmically carve and split the nib with a small penknife. The sound was a rhythmic snip and whittle, snip, scrape, snap. This was the tuning of the voice. The boring history of the slit was the history of capillary action. A rhythmic test stroke followed, a single silent line on a scrap of parchment to ensure the ink flowed with a synchronized pulse. The scribe would rhythmically lick the nib or dip the point into the dark oak gall ink. The sound was a rhythmic clink and suction. Clink, the glass inkwell. Sigh, the ink entering the quill. The infinite loom was now threaded with liquid shadows, ready to be woven into the script. The scribe's cadence, the rhythm of the scratch, dip, scratch. Once the vellum was ruled with lead lines, the real work began. The atmosphere was one of deep, focused stasis. The air was silent except for the rhythmic respiration of the scribe. The sound was the master rhythm of the archive, the scratch. The quill moving across the vellum produced a high-frequency vibration. It was a rhythmic zit, 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 dip, zit, zit, dip. This was the percussion of the word. Every 3 words, the scribe would rhythmically return to the well. The boring history of the serif was the history of the mechanical stop. Each letter was a construction project. A G or an M required 5 rhythmic movements of the hand. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of ink. To the observer, the scribe's head would rhythmically nod and sway as he tracked the exemplar text. This was the geometry of the copy, a boring history of repetitive mimicry, where the great stasis of the castle was reflected in the stasis of the line. The drying breath, the rhythm of the puff and wait. Because the ink was thick and acidic, it did not dry instantly. The atmosphere was one of humid suspension. The sound was the rhythm of the soft exhalation. After completing a line, the scribe would rhythmically blow across the wet ink to prevent smearing. The sound was a faint, rhythmic puff, puff. This was followed by the sand sift. The scribe would take a bowl of fine, clean sand and rhythmically shake and pour it over the page. The sound was a rhythmic shh, 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 the sound of microscopic rain. This was the boring history of saturation. The sand would rhythmically absorb the excess, leaving the ink matte and solid. The infinite loom of the archive was a slow-motion process of addition and subtraction. The page was not written, it was accrued through these rhythmic applications of gravity and breath. The closing of the vellum, the rhythm of the heavy hinge. The cycle of the scriptorium concluded with the rhythmic binding. The atmosphere was of Lebanon finality. The sound was the rhythm of the thump and creak. The finished pages were sewn into wooden boards and covered in heavy leather. The sound was a rhythmic punch and pull as the needle went through the spine. Thud, pull, sigh. This was the sealing of the memory.
The boring history of the brass clasp was the history of the final snap. When the book was closed, the iron or brass clasps would hit the wood with a rhythmic clack-clack. This was the acoustic guard of the archive. The infinite loom had knotted the thread. The memory of the castle was now a static block of wood and skin, stored in a mineral dark chest to wait for the rhythmic turning of the page in 100 years. The scribe, his fingers rhythmically stiff from the cold, would blow out his candle, leaving the geometry of the script to rest in the rhythmic silence of the keep. The tapestry's loom, the rhythmic insulation of wool. If the granite respiration was the castle's bone and the tallow vigil its fleeting sight, then the tapestry's loom was its soft, fibrous shield. In the medieval world, walls were not merely boundaries, they were radiators of cold. To inhabit a castle was to live in a perpetual state of acoustic and thermal war against the stone. This was the era of woolen insulation, a movement defined by the rhythmic interlacing of the warp and weft. For the American reader, the tapestry represents the organic counterpoint to the mineral, a study in the rhythmic muffling of the echo and the slow, fibrous breath of the wall. The weaving shed, the rhythm of the mechanical pulse. The life of the tapestry began in the atmospheric humidity of the weaving room. The air smelled of raw lanolin, vegetable dyes, and wet flax. It was a space of ordered motion where the infinite loom was a physical reality. The sound was the master rhythm of the creation, the shifting of the shed. The weavers worked in a synchronized cadence. The sound was a rhythmic thump, clack, swoosh. Thump, the treadle being depressed, clack, the wooden heddles shifting, and swoosh, the shuttle carrying the yarn through the opening. This was the percussion of the industry. Every thump was a rhythmic step toward the completion of a masterpiece. The boring history of the batten was the history of the compressed thread. After each pass of the shuttle, the weaver would use a heavy wooden comb to rhythmically beat down the yarn. The sound was a rhythmic clack, clack, clack. This ensured that the fabric was dense and windproof. To the weaver, the day was a fractal journey, the rhythmic hand-over-hand motion of the wool becoming a solid wall of color. The loom was an engine of density, turning the fragile hair of the sheep into a mineral-hard textile. The iron ring, the rhythm of the heavy hanging. Once completed, the tapestry was transported to the great hall to be married to the stone. This was the rhythm of the suspension. The atmosphere was one of dusty elevation. The sound was the rhythmic chink and thud. Massive iron rings were driven into the masonry, and the heavy wool was hoisted into place. The sound was a rhythmic creak and rustle as the fibers took the weight of their own gravity. Creak, sigh. This was the sonic transformation of the room. The boring history of the air gap was the history of the thermal buffer. The tapestry did not touch the stone. It hung an inch away, creating a static layer of still air. This static layer prevented the granite respiration from reaching the inhabitants. The sound of the tapestry hanging was acoustically dead. It swallowed the sharp pings of the drip and the whistles of the arrow slit, replacing them with a low-frequency muffle. The room became a sanctuary of softness. The fibrous breath, the rhythm of the gentle sway. A tapestry was never static. Because it was suspended, it responded to the rhythmic pressures of the castle's drafts. The atmosphere was one of animated surface. The sound was the rhythm of the soft brush. When a draft entered the room, the tapestry would rhythmically billow and sigh. The sound was a faint rhythmic shh as the fibers brushed against the limestone. Shh, pulse. This was the breathing of the wall. To the observer, the geometry of the hunt or the geometry of the saint depicted on the cloth would appear to move. This was the boring history of visual depth. The elasticity of the surface created a rhythmic vibration of the image. The tapestry was a loom of illusion, turning the rigid stone into a fluid horizon. The inhabitant, sitting by the measured hearth, would watch the rhythmic ripple of the wool, a sound and sight that provided a mechanical comfort against the inhuman stillness of the fortress. The dusting rod, the rhythm of the cloud release. Over time, the tapestry became a magnet for the minute. It captured the soot of the tallow and the dust of the flour. This led to the rhythm of the cleaning. The atmosphere was one of granular explosion. The sound was a rhythmic whack, whack, whack. Once a year, the hangings were taken down and beaten with wooden rods. The sound was a heavy, muffled percussion, thump, thump, thump. With every strike, a rhythmic cloud of history was released into the air, a mixture of wool fibers and smoke.
The boring history of the moth vigil was the history of biological defense. Herbs like lavender and wormwood were rhythmically sewn into the folds of the wool. The sound was a rhythmic crackle and scent release. The infinite loom of the tapestry was a living archive that required constant rhythmic refreshment. The cleaning was a purification ritual, ensuring the fibrous shield remained supple and strong for another decade. The midnight muffle, the rhythm of the silent barrier. The cycle of the tapestry concluded in the absolute stillness of the dark. The atmosphere was one of saturated acoustic silence. The sound was the rhythm of the absorbed echo. In a room lined with wool, the sound of a dropping candle or a shifting guard was stripped of its resonance. It was a hollow thud that died instantly. This was the rhythm of the piece. The tapestry acted as a sonic filter, separating the rhythmic chaos of the exterior from the rhythmic sleep of the interior. The boring history of the bed curtain was the history of the personal cocoon. Inside the tapestry-lined bed, the inhabitant breathed their own recycled warmth, a rhythmic respiration that was insulated from the world. The infinite loom had finished its weave. The wool was warm, dark, and still, a fibrous promise that the cold of the void would never breach the rhythmic sanctuary of the castle. The inhabitant drifted off to the faint, ghostly rustle of the wool, safe within the enclosure of the loom. The sentinels pacing, the rhythm of the watch. If the courtyard's grind was the castle's muscle, then the sentinel's pacing was its nervous system. High above the dust and the heat of the forge, the battlements offered a world of atmospheric isolation. To stand on the curtain wall was to inhabit a liminal space between the geological stasis of the fortress and the fluid chaos of the wild forest. This was the era of the temporal vigil, a movement defined by the rhythmic measurement of the horizon. For the American reader, the sentinel represents the psychological weight of the boundary, a study in the astringent smell of high altitudes and the rhythmic scuff of the boot on stone. The battlement's circuit, the rhythm of the step and turn. The primary reality of the sentinel was the repetitive geometry of the walk. The wall walk was a narrow path of lead and stone, protected by the rhythmic teeth of the crenellations. The atmosphere was one of expanding silence. The air was sharper and thinner than in the courtyard,
smelling of cold rain, lichen, and the metallic ozone of the sky. The sound was the master rhythm of the watch, the heel strike. It was a rhythmic tramp, 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 pause. The sentinel would walk 12 paces, stop at a merlon, the solid part of the wall, scan the landscape, and then rhythmically turn on the heel. This was the rhythm of the enclosure. The boring history of the heel turn was the history of the mechanical pivot. Over months of duty, the sentinel's boots would wear a rhythmic circular mark into the stone at each corner. To the inhabitant below, this distant, muffled percussion was the clock of the castle. It was a rhythmic assurance that the infinite loom of the defense was active. The watchman was a human pendulum, swinging back and forth across the geometry of the wall, his body a rhythmic instrument measuring the slow passage of the sun. The horizon scan, the rhythm of the visual loop. While the feet moved, the eyes engaged in a rhythmic orbit. The atmosphere was one of ocular discipline. The landscape, a tapestry of dark greens and grey silt, was divided into segments by the arrow slits and crenels. The sound was the rhythm of the wind in the ear. High up, the wind did not blow, it rhythmically buffeted the leather of the helmet and the wool of the cloak. Whir, flap, whir, flap. This was the white noise of the height. The boring history of the vantage point was the history of the recursive gaze. The sentinel would look from the black line of the forest to the grey line of the road, to the brown line of the river. Every 60 seconds, the visual loop would repeat. This rhythmic scanning was a biomechanical filter designed to detect the smallest deviation, the rhythmic flutter of a distant banner or the static column of smoke from a stranger's fire. The infinite loom of the sentinel's vision was weaving a fabric of safety out of the chaos of the distance. The hourglass, the rhythm of the falling grain. To mark the passage of time in the silence, the guard used the sand glass. The atmosphere around the guard niche was one of temporal gravity. The sound was the rhythmic hiss and flip. Every half hour, the sand would finish its rhythmic descent through the glass neck. The sound was a microscopic shh, thump, as the guard turned the frame over. Shh, thump. This was the mechanical pulse of the vigil.
The glass neck was the history of the restricted flow. The sand was geological time being rhythmically funneled and measured. To the sentinel, the glass was a liquid anchor to reality. The rhythmic scratch of the guard's tally stick against the stone wall, marking the end of each glass, was the physical archive of the endurance. The infinite loom was winding the day through a hole in the glass, turning the infinite sky into a finite series of rhythmic units. The changing of the guard, the rhythm of the relief. The climax of the sentinel's rhythm occurred during the shift exchange. The atmosphere was one of vocal and metallic interaction. The sound was the rhythmic clank and voice. From the spiral stairs, a new set of footsteps would emerge, a rhythmic clatter, clatter, clink. This was followed by the password ritual, a rhythmic halt and query. Clank, the spear hitting the stone. Voice, the low-frequency murmur of the watchword. This was the history of procedural continuity. The infinite loom of the watch was handed over from one man to the next like a woven thread. The sound of the relieved guard descending the stairs was a rhythmic decrescendo, a sound of gravity reclaiming the body. The new sentinel would then take up the rhythmic pacing, his boots finding the same circular marks in the stone, ensuring the great stasis of the castle's awareness was never rhythmically broken. The night horn, the rhythm of the spectral note. As the pale horizontal light faded, the sentinel's pacing entered its most atmospheric phase. The atmosphere was one of obsidian depth. The sound was the rhythm of the watchman's horn.
To signal the all is well to the town or the valley, the sentinel would blow a single long note. The sound was a rhythmic, mournful roar and fade. Boom! This was the acoustic anchor for the world below. The echo return was the history of the reflected boundary. The note would hit the distant hills and return as a ghostly rhythmic pulse. This dialogue of sound defined the limits of the castle's reach. As the sentinel resumed his pacing in the dark, his footsteps now a dull thud on the damp stone, the castle felt like a celestial ship sailing through the infinite sea of the night. The infinite loom of the watch was now a silent weave, a rhythmic vigil of the ear that waited for the first rhythmic chirp of the dawn birds. The deep well, the liquid heart of the stasis. If the sentinel's pacing was the castle's nervous system, the deep well was its primal biological core. In the medieval world, a castle without water was merely a stone tomb. To stand over the well mouth, usually located in the most protected undercroft of the keep, was to face the rhythmic mystery of the depths. This final movement, the deep well, explores the boring history of hydraulic gravity. For the American reader, used to the invisible pressurized flow on demand of city pipes, the well represents the ultimate connection to the earth, a study in the mineral scent of the abyss and the rhythmic echo of the droplet. The shaft's abyss, the rhythm of the vertical void. The well was a negative tower, a perfect cylinder driven hundreds of feet down into the bedrock stasis. The atmosphere around the well mouth was of ozone and humidity. The air was significantly colder than the rest of the undercroft, smelling of wet limestone, iron-rich silt, and deep ancient silence. The sound was the rhythm of the hollow respiration. The shaft acted as a giant flute. As the granite respiration of the castle moved over the opening, it produced a low-frequency drone. It was a rhythmic hum and sigh. Hum. This was the voice of the subterranean. The masonry lining was the history of the perfect circle. Each stone in the well shaft was rhythmically curved and precision fit without mortar to allow the water to seep through. To look down was to see a geometry of the void, a rhythmic repetition of stone rings vanishing into a liquid obsidian. The infinite loom of the well was a process of vertical descent, a rhythmic reminder that the great stasis of the castle was anchored in the fluid dark of the world's interior. The crank and coiling, the rhythm of the ascending weight. To retrieve the water, the castle relied on the great windlass. The atmosphere was one of mechanical tension. The air was filled with the scent of wet hemp and the metallic tang of the iron bucket hoop. The sound was the master rhythm of the liquid heart, the crank and creak. A servant would grasp the wooden handle and begin the repetitive labor of the lift. The sound was a rhythmic squeak, clack, groan. Squeak, the axle, clack, the safety pole, and groan, the hemp rope stretching under the weight of the full bucket. This was the rhythm of the hydration.
That is where the true spirit of how were castles used in medieval times rests. Not in grand feasts or legends, but in the quiet grace of gratitude itself. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright,
and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night,